Can you hear me now? Okay. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this special event hosted by the World Affairs Council of Northern California in association with Books, Inc. Yeah. My name is Steve Katz. I'm the publisher of Mother Jones, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. Thank you. Thank you very much. I can also tell you that it's 6-0. I gotta love that. It was bottom of the 5th. So, the World Affairs Council offers a neutral forum on critical international issues and opportunities. To learn more about the Council, hear its programs, or join its membership, please visit its website at worldaffairs.org. This program is being recorded for radio. Special thanks goes to our audio engineer, Jim Bennett. Please take a moment to turn off all those pesky cell phones and other things that make noise. Okay. We will be taking your questions in the second part of the program, so please make use of the blue questions on your chair. If there were blue cards on your question cards on your chair, hopefully they were there. If they weren't, we'll also be doing direct questions from the audience as well. And council staff will be collecting the cards during the program and handing them to me. It's my honor to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. As many of you know, Amy Goodman is the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, a national, daily, independent, award-winning news program airing on over 1,100 public television and radio stations worldwide. She's the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers. This includes her 5th and latest book, The Silenced Majority, which gives voice to the many ordinary people standing up to corporate and government power and refusing to be silent. Goodman is also the recipient of numerous awards for her work in journalism. She is the first journalist to receive the Right Livelihood Award, and her reporting on East Timor and Nigeria received the George Polk Award, Robert F. Kennedy Prize for International Reporting, and the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Award. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about the voices behind the scenes of American democracy, please join me in welcoming Amy Goodman.
And I didn't even say the score yet. Could we have the lights up a little bit? I was wondering if we could put the lights up a little bit. It's always, one of the great pleasures of coming out of the studio, much better, is to be able to see people as we travel around this country, to see and to listen. It's a great honor to be here. I want to thank the World Affairs Council and Mother Jones Magazine, my co-author of our new book, The Silenced Majority, Dennis Moynihan, and all of my colleagues at Democracy Now! We are on a 100-city tour. I'm not sure where we are right now, in the 60s. I said recently to someone I was so proud we'd hit city 60, and they said, "You mean you only have 40 cities to go?" I found that a very negative comment. But it has truly been an amazing journey. We began right after the Republican convention, doing fundraisers for community and public radio and television. Democracy Now! Started 16 years ago on a few dozen community radio stations and Pacifica radio stations. Thought we'd end. We were the only daily election show in public broadcasting at the election of 1996. Our mission was to find out, really, at that time, why most people didn't vote. I had been in Haiti. People were gunned down going to the polls, yet the vast majority of people voted. So why in this country, when we don't face anything like those challenges, did most people not vote? And that's what we spent the primary season looking at. What were people doing in their communities? I never thought it was apathy. Maybe involved in another way, or perhaps didn't think that there was a choice. And then the election came and went, and there was more demand for the show after than before because we were covering grassroots movements. And then the week of September 11th, 2001, we went on the first community television station, public access in New York, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and the show just took off. More and more TV stations around the country started asking for us, and we were sending the video cassette, it was those times, out by FedEx in big black garbage bags. The FedEx men would come because so many stations were asking for it, and then NPR stations would ask in their community, and then PBS stations. It's a great honor now to be broadcasting on KQED, PBS. And now we're broadcasting on over 1,100 public radio and television stations across the country and across the world, as well as on 300 radio stations in Spanish. The hunger... I think this is a testament to the hunger for independent voices. I want to talk about the elections, the conventions. We began at the Republican convention following the money. My colleague Mike Burke, senior producer at Democracy Now!, and Hani Massoud, our video producer, we were walking through the hallways of the corporate suite simply to follow the money because this is the first post-Citizens United election. And that's extremely significant. I was speaking the other day in Nevada City, and someone said, don't call it Citizens United, call it Corporations United. And we have to follow the money. What this means is that the floodgates for corporate money are wide open. We won't even know where most of the money comes from. Billions are expected to be spent by the Democrats and the Republicans. And so as Mike and Hani walked the hallways of the corporate suites, they bumped into Sheldon Adelson, the well-known Vegas casino magnate who promised to give something like $100 million in this election cycle, has been investigated for bribery and corruption in Macau in the building of his casinos. And Mike went to ask just how much money he'd be spending, and there was a woman standing between Mr. Adelson and Mike, and she stepped back and basically body slam Mike. He didn't even know what hit him, and Hani Massoud is a strong, tall video cameraman, leaps tall buildings in a single bound, and the next thing they knew, this woman had grabbed his camera and run into the Adelson suite. Hani put his foot in the door to try to reclaim his camera, and she smashed it on the ground. Before they knew it, Mike was pulling out his phone to try to document this, use the video on the phone, and the Adelson team was trying to pull it out of his hand. And then one of the top spokespeople for Mr. Adelson came out and handed him his card, said, we'll make you whole, I'll deal with this tomorrow, please give me a call and we'll take care of this. And Mike was saying, what are you talking about? And he said, who is that woman? And the spokesperson said, that would be Mr. Adelson's daughter. And then she came out and apologized twice. It was really something. And so many people saw this, and of course we had the video of it. And so, it was in the New York Times, it was in Politico, even Glenn Beck had it right on his website. And so the Adelsons felt they had to put out a press release, and the next day they put out a press release. They are well lawyered up, if nothing else, being very careful not to make any allegations, but to say we believe that reporters should be nonviolent, they said, which is something we agree with. And they went on to wish us well covering the Republican convention. I went on to the convention floor in the New York delegation. David Koch, a New York delegate. David and Charles Koch are the billionaire oil and gas magnate funders of the Tea Party movement. Very important to talk to them. And I went up to them with our videographer and said to Mr. Koch, as he was sitting with other delegates in the New York delegation, are you concerned that unchecked concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? I mean, within seconds, all of the delegates around him stood up to protect him from the question. It was quite something, as we tried to pull a still from the video showing him. He is a towering figure, but he was cowering behind the delegates who all stood up. I asked the person who stood up next to him, the longtime chair of the Republican Party, Ed Cox, And he is the son-in-law of Richard Nixon. He's married to Tricia Nixon Cox. And I asked him, are you concerned that unchecked concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And he said no. So the last night of the convention, we were over in the New Hampshire delegation, and the mystery guest came on the stage. Yes, that would be Clint Eastwood. And he brought that chair on the stage, and that chair, where he was talking to an invisible Obama. I mean, actually, the racism underlying this, the idea of the invisible man by Ralph Ellison. But then he went on to say that critics say, President Obama said he would close Guantanamo. It's been years and he hasn't. I actually thought that was a fair criticism. I just didn't expect to hear it from the stage of the Republican convention. And he went on to say that President Obama had presided over the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan, and something to the effect of Mitt Romney would pull out the troops the next morning. I think there was no one more surprised to hear that than Mitt Romney. And then Mitt Romney walked out on the stage. It would be the biggest moment of his political life. He was walking from the back down the aisle. We were across the convention. There were thousands of people. The only way we could see where he was coming from was on the Jumbotron. And I told our videographer, start filming the Jumbotron, because I recognized the aisle he was walking down. It was the aisle of the New York delegation. And as he came up to Mr. Koch, he was standing along with the other delegates, and Mitt Romney stopped, shook his hand, put his arm on him, pointed at him, and then moved on. And when we talked about that relationship, it would be important to have that image. At the end of the night, we called back to our team in New York and said, pull the Reuters pool feed and, just get that image. And they said, there's no such image there. And we said, well, what do you mean? Reuters gives us the full walk and the entry. And he said, Robbie Karen, our video producer, said, no, when it comes to that point, the video cuts away. It goes to two young women with red, white, and blue feather boas, and they're energetically dancing. And then it goes to a big screen of the convention floor. And then it goes back to Mitt Romney further down, shaking hands as he goes up on the stage. So we took the video that we had from the Jumbotron, what actually happened on the floor. And frankly, it's not surprising. He was shaking a lot of hands. It would make sense. He would shake the hand of one of his largest donors. The Koch brothers promised to spend something like $400 million in this election. What was surprising was that the rest of the world didn't see that, though they saw most everything else of his entry. So we took the Jumbotron image, what actually took place on the floor, and what the networks got, what the networks showed the world, and we made a split screen, and we showed that the next day on Democracy Now! That's why it's important to watch Democracy Now! And the networks then picked it up, the Koch-Romney handshake. We call that trickle-up journalism. And then moving on to the Democratic Convention. It's so important to cover the movements. It's movements that make history. And so the first day of the Democratic Convention, right at the time that it was being gavelled open in Charlotte, I got a text that there would be an action outside, and I came to a corner, and the undocubus pulled up. It was covered in butterflies, and a number of people streamed out. These are the undocumented immigrants in this country, inspired by young dreamers, the young undocumented students who have sat in at President Obama's campaign offices and other senators and Congress members' offices, risking more than arrest. They are risking deportation to show how brave they are. And, President Obama was a community organizer, and it, I think, was very embarrassing to him. I mean, think about Charlotte. Charlotte is this city rich with civil rights history. Remember the Greensboro sit-ins at the Woolworth's lunch counter, young students who had done this in 1960, and that inspired the students at Johnson C. Smith College in Charlotte, the historically black college there, and they marched on their own lunch counters. I think the Dreamer movement, the young undocumented immigrants who are demanding that the DREAM Act be passed, that there be a rational compassionate immigration policy in this country are the modern-day civil rights movement. And ultimately, President Obama conceded to their demand somewhat this summer, issuing a kind of executive order that said dreamers, undocumented immigrants 30 years or under who fit a certain criteria could have a reprieve from deportation for a couple of years, could work, could go to school. Okay, they couldn't get health insurance, but they could, work and go to school. And that was a tremendous victory for these young people, but they want more. And in the undocubus were their parents as well. This movement is just growing larger, and they came out very quickly from the bus. This is the first day of the convention. The rain is pouring down. The police are pouring in. And they started walking vigorously, saying, "No papers, no fear. No papers, no fear." I was interviewing one of them, Rosie Karaskow, when a media personality came up to me. It's hard to talk about many of the people on television as journalists. You know what we see on television, these pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. And said, I had been on some panels with him, and he said, "Amy, what's going on here?" And I said, "It looks like these people are about to get arrested." And he said, what are they saying? And I was interviewing Rosie Karaskow, one of the leaders. She was about to get arrested with her husband and her daughter. And I said, "Well, why don't you ask her?" And he said, "Well, why don't you just quickly tell me?" And I said, "Rosie, why don't you tell this gentleman why you're here?" And she said, "Because I want to know what kind of legacy President Obama wants to leave." She said, "I want to know if he wants to be remembered as the president who deported more immigrants than any president in U.S. history, or whether he wants to be remembered as the president on the side of the immigrants." Pretty eloquent. And the media personality took out his notebook and started to take notes. Why is it so difficult to talk to people at the target end of policy, at the heart of a story? Oh, her husband got out, too, from the bus, Martin Nzueta, and he said, "I've paid taxes in this country for 18 years, which is more than Citibank can say." And they started marching, and they came to the gates of the Democratic Convention. And they unfurled a banner that had a big butterfly on it. There was a young woman who had her arm wrapped around the waist of an older, much smaller woman. It was her mother. And she wouldn't let go from the bus right to the convention gates. And then they kneeled on the banner. And I said to the younger woman, "I bet you fit into this category of young people who would be able to get deferred action, would be able to stay and get a reprieve and not be deported, not fear that." And she said, "I do fit into that category, but my mother doesn't, and if she's deported, I might as well go with her." And then another young woman was kneeling right before she got arrested on the banner, and I said, "What's with the butterflies, this big butterfly, the butterflies on the bus?" And she said, "Well, because butterflies know no borders. Butterflies are free." And with that, 10 of the young people and their families got arrested. Movements are what make this country great. The trip we have taken has been remarkable. From the Democratic Convention, we've traveled through the country. We were in Blacksburg, Virginia, where the shooting massacre took place in 2007 that took the lives of 32 people at Virginia Tech. We were there interviewing Colin Goddard, one of the survivors. He was shot 4 times in his French class, but he was lucky, if you could possibly use that word, because in his class of 16, 9 people were killed. He now works at the Brady campaign against gun violence. Jim Brady was the former press secretary of President Ronald Reagan, and when the attempted assassination of the president took place, he was shot in the head, and he and his wife Sarah founded the Brady campaign against gun violence, and they launched a campaign to get Jim Lehrer, the first debate moderator, presidential debate moderator, to ask a question about gun violence. After all, it was taking place at the University of Denver, Colorado, down the road from the Aurora shootings a few months before, and of course from Columbine more than a decade ago. And so we were in Virginia Tech just before going to Denver for the big debate. And we walked in Norris Hall, and Colin Goddard, who is leading this campaign, to try to get questions asked about gun violence, took us in the hallway and described what took place, and described how when he dove under his desk after his French professor looked out the door after hearing the crackle of gunshot, said he reached for his phone, his Nextel phone. He'd never done this before, and called 911. And he was under his desk speaking very fast, very quietly. His French professor had already been killed. And he said, please come to Norris Hall. There's been a shooting. They said, where's Norris Hall? He said, Virginia Tech. They said, where's Virginia Tech? He said, Blacksburg. They said, where's Blacksburg? He said, Virginia. They said, where? He didn't know if it was another country he was calling or if it was, information services here. But eventually they linked up, but he'd lost the phone by then. The young woman laying next to him under the next desk had the phone and was describing everything to authorities. And just before I talked to Colin, I talked to Nikki Giovanni, the great poet who's a university distinguished professor at Virginia Tech. She doesn't like to talk about the shooting. But there she was in a room of her own, in her own office, and that's the beauty of radio, the intimacy of just sitting down, and even with television, when keeping it, simple, to be able to have that privilege of putting a mic to someone, holding out that microphone, going to where the silence is. I asked her about her poetry, her art, and then about the shooting. And she said she was in San Francisco at the time. She'd come for a conference, and she didn't know what possessed her, but before the shooting, she just told the conference she had to go home. And she went across the country. It still hadn't happened, and she was leaving the airport in Blacksburg, in Roanoke, and driving to Blacksburg. And she saw a TV car shoot by at about 120 miles an hour. She turned on the radio, and she heard something had happened. She saw the police blocked off the Blacksburg exit, and she thought, that's Cho, that's Cho. That was her poetry student, Cho. She had taught him a year before the shootings. She couldn't reach him. She was scared of him. He wore sunglasses, hat over his face, and she told him to leave his class. Not that she didn't deal with difficult students, but she'd never faced anything like this before. And he said he didn't have to go, and she said, it's true. She said, if you don't leave, I quit my professorship. And she told that to the higher-ups at the university. This was more than a year before Cho opened fire. It is quite remarkable, the red flags that went up. And in each of these massacres we've seen, the red flags before. This young student had stalked women on campus, had been institutionalized, yet he could still get a weapon legally, a gun. And that's why Colin and the campaign, the Brady campaign, wanted a question to be asked. It goes to more than gun violence. It also goes to who has the power in this country, and goes to the lobbying interests like the NRA. So we flew from Blacksburg, Virginia, to Denver. And we expanded the first presidential debate. We were just down the road at a Comcast facility. We looked at the video of workers setting up the debate at the University of Denver, the blue backdrop. We wanted to see just how it would look, the two podiums, what they looked like. And we got two similar podiums, and we had a blue backdrop that says democracynow.org, very similar to the one that they had. And we brought in third-party presidential candidates. We brought in Jill Stein, the presidential candidate of the Green Party. We brought in Rocky Anderson, the presidential candidate of the Justice Party. We invited Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico. He's the presidential candidate of the Libertarian Party, but he didn't come. And we kept it simple. The candidates stood at their podiums just like Mitt Romney and President Obama did. Jim Lehrer introduced the debate, and he said that they would first talk about the economy, gave President Obama 2 minutes. When he was done, gave Governor Romney 2 minutes. We stopped the videotape, and we said, Dr. Jill Stein, you have 2 minutes. And when she was finished, Rocky Anderson, 2 minutes on the economy. And when he was done, back to my colleague Jim Lehrer at the University of Denver. And that's the debate we brought you. Yes, breaking the sound barrier. That's what democracy sounds like. It is not about who you vote for. It's about having a robust discussion about the key issues of the day. You know how the Commission on Presidential Debates, how it even came to be in charge? Remember, the League of Women Voters used to run these debates for decades, and then in the 80s, the parties wrested control from the League of Women Voters. They first gave them a 12-page secret contract to sign, and the League said, we're independent. We are not going to sign anything like this. And they actually held a news conference and made the contract public, and that was the end. The Republican and Democratic parties took over the debate. It sounds like an independent commission or a quasi-governmental commission on presidential debates. It's simply a private corporation that's sponsored by, Anheuser-Busch and the International Bottled Water Association and other corporations. But most importantly, it's run by the two parties. Is it any surprise you don't hear these third-party discussions? They make the case that unless they rise to a certain level in the polls, they shouldn't be included, but it is a vicious cycle. When you have 50 million people watching these debates, how do you get heard if you are not included in these debates? And so the response was electric all over the country to our expanding the debate series, and we continued it for all three debates, right through to this last debate on foreign policy. We were in San Rafael, and we were at the Osher Marin Jewish Community Center. The presidential candidates flew out. We had a large audience watching, just as the presidential candidates from the two major parties held their debate in Boca Raton, and we kept stopping the videotape. And then I would go back to Bob Schieffer, who was moderator of the debate in Boca Raton. The parties run it. The Democratic Party, represented by Mike McCurry, the former spokesperson for President Bill Clinton, and the Republican Party has always been represented by Frank Fahrenkopf, who used to be head of the Republican Party, and now, well, this is a very good bet for both parties, and he knows what a good bet is all about. He's the executive director of the American Gaming Association, chief, lobbyist for gambling in this country. But it's a very serious issue, because the most important thing in this country is to have that debate about the critical issues of the day. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they are sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. We went from Denver to Colorado Springs on the eve of the 11th anniversary of the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan. We broadcast from the Tim Gill Center for Public Media, part of Rocky Mountain PBS. And we invited Dave Phillips, who was nominated for a Pulitzer for his series in the Colorado Gazette, which later became a book called Lethal Warriors. He wrote a book about a unit at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs that went to Iraq, came back, went to Iraq again. They named themselves Lethal Warriors and came back, and they couldn't turn off the kill switch. And they were killing their girlfriends and their wives. They were killing other soldiers and strangers. The murder rate in Fort Carson, 114 times that of surrounding Colorado Springs. You could only imagine what they were doing in Iraq. And we also had on Andrew Pagani, who now counsels soldiers and veterans. He himself was a soldier in Iraq a few years ago, and he had taken Lariam, the anti-malaria drug. He said he was hallucinating, and he saw a Bradley tank explode in Iraqi, and he simply lost it. He had a breakdown, and he asked for help. But he was brought up, the first soldier since Vietnam, to be brought up on charges of cowardice. Do you know what a soldier brought up on charges of cowardice faces? The death penalty. We then went back to Denver because I was invited by Al Jazeera English to debate David Weston, the former president of ABC World News Tonight. So I went into the PBS NewsHour studios in Denver, and David Weston was in New York. And we had a discussion about the role of media covering the elections and war. And he talked about how he felt the media was doing a good job in expanding the debate. I described what we did with the third-party candidates. And when he said he thought the media was doing a good job, for example, when it comes to war, I begged to differ. And I went back to the invasion of Iraq. 6 weeks before March 19, 2003, when the U.S. bombed Iraq. It was the 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving his push for war, the Secretary of State, General Colin Powell, at the United Nations. He was seen as a very credible figure because he had been very hesitant about the war. But he, on that day, February 5th, 2003, said the evidence was in on weapons of mass destruction. It was the final nail in the coffin for so many. So the group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR.org, a media watch group, did a study of the 2 weeks around Colin Powell giving his push for war at the UM. And they looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts, the NBC Nightly News, the CBS Evening News, the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and the ABC World News Tonight, when David Weston was the head. In those 4 major nightly newscasts for those 2 weeks, there were 393 interviews done around war. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? 3. 3 of almost 400. That's no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war, I said to David Weston. And he said, it may surprise you, Amy, that I agree with you. That really did surprise me. And he said he'll forever regret that when Peter Jennings was alive, you know, the anchor of ABC World News Tonight who died of lung cancer, he had grave reservations about the argument that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and that David Weston told him to hold back. He said he was under a lot of pressure. David Weston said he himself was under a lot of pressure. Just an interesting fact. And before I end, and then we'll have this discussion, I wanted just to talk about the importance of movements. The Arab Spring, Tunisia, December 2010, young Tunisian named Mohamed Bouazizi comes out of university, goes into the marketplace because there's no opportunity, sells fruit and vegetables. The authorities steal his scale, and he's so frustrated. He sets himself on fire, and that sparks the Tunisian revolution, which then ignites the Egyptian revolution. How many of you heard Democracy Now! Producer Sharif Abdel-Qaddous report from Tahrir, this remarkable young reporter who we worked with for 8 years, and then he flew home as he heard what was happening, as he was getting texts, friends and family saying, I'll die for my country, and he was saying, these are not political people. This is a country, my country, that is changing. Sharif comes from a very illustrious family in Egypt. His grandfather, the most famous writer in Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Qaddous. And he basically flew into Tahrir. And he didn't leave for 18 days. And the video reports that you got, whether you listened on radio or watched on television, were truly remarkable. You know, Mubarak plunged the country into digital darkness. He shut off the internet. Actually, he didn't do it himself. He used a California company, Naras, to do it. And when there was global outcry, Naras put out a press release saying, we were only following orders. We have heard that before. But even during this time, Sharif became one of the top tweeters in the world. Truly amazing, his reports. And then the internet came up, but the thugs broke into the international and U.S. TV offices and broke the satellites. Now, Democracy Now! started in a very scrappy way 16 years ago. And when we went to television, September of 2001, we pioneered a way, because we couldn't afford the satellites, to send broadcast quality video through the internet. So though we use satellites now, we know how to send through the internet. And when the satellites went down and the networks looked like old Democracy Now!, a kind of fuzzy Skype, I remember seeing Anderson Cooper in his hotel room with a lower third that said, reporting from an undisclosed location. And there was Sharif in the middle of Tahrir saying just where he was, saying this is the safest place to be in Egypt. And he and Hani would walk Tahrir, and Sharif would do these remarkable interviews with Ahdaf Souef, the great Egyptian writer, and Nawal Saadawi, the 79-year-old feminist, former presidential candidate, imprisoned under Sadat, exiled under Mubarak, who was holding salons before Tahrir with disgruntled young people saying, "We will win," she would say, "we will win." And you'd meet the young high school student who put out the broadsheet in Tahrir, Voices of Tahrir, in the shadow of the state media building that had spewed lies for so many decades. And those reports would come through the internet, and we would broadcast them from Democracy Now! And he was being interviewed on all the networks, CNN and MSNBC and NBC. We call that trickle-up journalism. And that sparked, I think, partly Arab Spring, sparked Wisconsin. The uprising that Wisconsin had never seen before. 150,000 people, maybe partly inspired by Governor Scott Walker. And I remember we flew directly there to Wisconsin, covering grassroots movements, going into the state capitol building that was occupied by the people of Wisconsin, seeing some of the biggest guys I'd ever seen. The Oshkosh prison guards. And I said to them, "Who did you vote for?" And they said, "Well, Governor Walker, of course." And I said, "Then what are you doing here?" And they said, "Protesting Governor Walker, of course." They were protesting that he was going after the public unions. They said their wives, the teachers, their neighbors. And then I interviewed an older gentleman with gray hair and glasses marching in the snow with 150,000 people outside in the grounds of the Capitol. And he's holding a sign that says, IRS auditors against Walker. And this is where I will end this part of this evening. Then Occupy, the encampment that took place on September 17th, 2011, just over a year ago. I think partly inspired by what happened a few weeks before. Thousands marched, made a ring around the Rose Garden in Washington, around the White House, to try to get President Obama to stop the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline from Alberta to the Gulf of Mexico. 1,200 people got arrested, and many marched up to New York. And then thousands went to Wall Street, and they found this little park, Zuccotti Park, which they called Liberty Square, Liberty Plaza, and they set up an encampment. And I remember the corporate media not covering it the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day. And yet New York was the media metropolis of the world. It was right under these media personalities' noses. Then watching the networks one morning, and they started to ridicule. Who are these people? Why can't they get it together to make a particular demand? What do they even want? They can't choose a spokesperson who we'd have in the studio? And I thought, really? They don't have a particular demand. I think any Madison Avenue executive would drool to be the one credited with the slogan, "We are the 99%. I believe it's the most resonant slogan in the history of this country, whether you agree with it or not. And Occupy has occupied the language, English language and many other languages as well. And I thought about Mahatma Gandhi and his words. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. And I'll just end with this. One more movement that inspired, I think, Occupy Wall Street. The signs that some people held walking into Wall Street, walking to Zuccotti Park, that said, "Too much doubt," and "I am Troy Davis." And it's particularly relevant to raise here as You all weigh a ballot initiative about whether California will be the next state to end the death penalty in the United States. And I wanted to end with an excerpt of the book that we've just come out with, Dennis Moynihan and I, The Silenced Majority. The book, we call it that because I really do believe those who are concerned about war, those who are concerned about the growing inequality in this country, those who are concerned about climate change, something that was never mentioned in the presidential debates. You know, the fires in Colorado and California, the drenching rains in Florida, the Dust Bowl conditions of the Midwest, the fate of the planet. Those who are concerned about these issues are not a fringe minority or a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. And so these signs, Troy Davis, I thought I'd just end by reading an excerpt of our column about just who Troy Davis was. It was September 17th that people took over Occupy, and September 21st at 7 p.m. that Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were reporting live from outside Georgia's death row in Jackson, awaiting news about whether the Supreme Court would spare his life. Davis was sentenced to death for the murder of off-duty Savannah police officer Mark McPhail in 1989. 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses in Troy Davis's trial later recanted or changed their testimony, some alleging police intimidation for their original false statements. No physical evidence linked Davis to the shooting. Davis was one of more than 3,200 prisoners on death row in the United States. He'd faced 3 prior execution dates. With each one, global awareness grew. Human rights groups like the NAACP and Amnesty International took up his case. The Pope called for clemency for Troy Davis. So did the former FBI Director William Sessions and the former Republican Georgia Congressmember Bob Barr. So did Alan Alt, the former prison warden at the death row prison in Jackson, and other prison wardens who were not opposed to the death penalty, but they were opposed to it in the case of Troy Davis, saying too much doubt. When we came onto the grounds of the prison, the Department of Corrections gave us a very thin press packet. It talked about the schedule Troy Davis would have for the last day of his life. 9 to 3, he would see family, and then at 3, a routine physical. Routine physical? Remember a while ago, a Texas man attempted suicide on death row. He was rushed to the hospital, they got him better, and then they executed him. And the next page talked about what Troy Davis would have for dinner, in detail. He had turned down the special meal. The press kit described the standard tray he'd be offered: grilled cheeseburgers, oven brown potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a great beverage. It also listed the lethal cocktail that would follow: pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, Ativan, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, and the potassium chloride stops the heart. The only 2 things that Davis could have a say in, the Last Supper and the sedative, he turned down. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside. Time of death, 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's final words. He said, "I'd like to address the McPhail family, let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I'm innocent. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth." He then said, "I ask my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he turned to his executioners and said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls. God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As I stood on the grounds of the prison just after Troy Davis was executed, the Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. And I was reminded what Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He responded, "I think it would be a good idea." Thank you.
Bottom of the seventh. Thanks, Amy. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Not really? More? More? How's that? Okay. Thanks. So, Amy, I wanted to, first of all, thank you for that talk. It was really terrific. And I wanted to spend a few minutes kind of looking at the experience, the history that we've all lived through over the last couple of years from a couple of different angles and just get your thoughts on things. If we were to go back to mid-2009, say, and project forward all the things that have happened since then, I don't think we would have anticipated Arab Spring, Wisconsin, the Keystone Action, Occupy, Chicago teachers strike, and so on. So when we take a moment and kind of look backwards at the extraordinary moment that we've been living through over the last 18 months to 2 years, a lot has happened. Okay. Right now, though, I think if we were to have a conversation with folks here, I think there would, and I'm projecting, so forgive me, but I think there might be an atmosphere of lack of clarity about the way forward, or a sense of discouragement about what has happened to the movements as they flourished and then seemed to fade, or seemed to go in directions that were not of the intention of the folks who were at the front. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, your thoughts, especially being on the road now over the last 100 cities worth or whatever it is of time. What do you make of that? What do you make of the kind of the balance between the pressure that has been imposed upon these movements from the outside or the lack of attention to them from the media on the one hand, and on the other hand, your sense, your experience, your Democracy Now's interaction with the movements themselves? What kind of lessons have you picked up from that over the last couple of years?
You know, what happened in November of 2008, the election of President Obama, no matter whether people voted for him or not, was an historic moment. I mean, here you have the first African-American president in a land with a legacy of slavery. And the number of people and movements who turned out to vote, the overwhelming number of young people, not only voting but organizing, people of color, particularly African Americans. We'd never seen anything like it. The peace movement rallied behind President Obama. You know, I think the reason he became president, first he had to get the Democratic nomination, and the main difference between him and Hillary Clinton was that she voted for the war in Iraq, and she clung to that position almost to the bitter end, and when she saw she was going down, she said maybe she was wrong, but it was too late. The environmental movement, the gay and lesbian movement, all of these movements coalesced. And the community organizer-in-chief became the commander-in-chief. But then the question is, who does the community organizing then? And I think, one, people were shocked at what they'd accomplished and exhausted. But also they didn't want to contribute to a right-wing backlash, like the birther movement that's so terribly racist and saying that President Obama could not be from here, he is the other. But, you know, you don't achieve democracy in a day. It is a constant struggle every single day. And when he is sitting in the Oval Office, and those who are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth whisper their demands in his ear, if he can't point out the window of the Oval Office and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, he is in big trouble. And that's when he agrees with you. What about when you disagree with him? In a democracy, you have an obligation to make your demands known. I mean, look at the record over these years. Saying he would close Guantanamo, it wasn't closed. Flying to Copenhagen, Democracy Now! Is at every global environment, climate change summit in Copenhagen and Cancun and Durban, the People's Summit in Bolivia. President Obama flew into Cancun and basically scuttled any kind of meaningful greenhouse gas reducing agreement. He has presided over the deportation of more immigrants than any president in history, and the Obama administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers for espionage than all presidents combined in history. All of the movements that elected President Obama, these are the movements that care about these issues. And I think people are trying to find their way.
So if I could kind of build on that, is it your sense that there was an investment by movement leadership in a path forward that went through the Democratic Party and the White House, and that perhaps now is a time to learn about a different way of doing organizing?
Well, I think Occupy was a huge expression of enormous frustration. And, the fact that so many people carried so many signs and had so many different issues, I think was actually its strength. But all of these different issues that people felt betrayed around, and also this essential issue, it's more than of the economy, but of the growing inequality in this country. The vast sucking sound from the bottom to the top, that if this was happening under President Bush, for example, not to mention the drone wars, people would not stand for it. And the question is, what happens next? Occupy surprised many. The encampments were eviscerated by the police, and that's another really important issue to talk about. It's something I'm deeply concerned about, and that is the militarization of police.
Well, let me ask you about that as well. In your book, you referenced the work of Josh Stearns from Free Press. Stearns is a staff person at Free Press, which does media policy reform. And beginning in early 2011, Josh began to just record information that came to him from journalists or activists about the arrests of journalists during protests and organizing actions around the country. When the book went to press, you and Dennis Moynihan mentioned that there were 60 recorded arrests of journalists at that point. And I actually checked with Josh today, and at this point, he's recorded more than 100.
I mean, the arrests of journalists, unlawful arrests overall. I mean, the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City after Occupy Wall Street, the largest mass arrest in U.S. history.
But let's stick with the journalists for a second, because the question I wanted to ask you was whether, as a journalist, you see a changing dynamic between the media, broadly defined, and the security system.
Well, I've had my own experience with the police, along with my colleague Sharif Abdel-Qaddous, who went on to cover the Egyptian Revolution. He didn't get arrested in Mubarak's Egypt, but he got arrested along with me and Nicole Salazar, a multimedia producer, in the streets of St. Paul as we were covering the 2008 Republican Convention. Very briefly, just to say what happened, it was the first day, September 1st, Labor Day, beautiful blue sky day, 10,000 people marched for peace, led by soldiers in full military regalia who were protesting the war. Whether they served or not, whether they were going back on tour or not, they were there to say no to war. and thousands of civilians. And they marched from the St. Paul City Hall to the Excel Center. We interviewed them. I went to the convention floor then to interview delegates. And Sharif and Nicole went back to the TV studio to digitize tape and prepare the show. And I got a call on the floor of the convention from our senior producer, Mike Burke. He said, come quickly to 7th Jackson. Sharif and Nicole have been bloodied and beaten by the police and arrested. I said, what are you talking about? And I raced to 7th and Jackson. The riot police had fully contained the area. You know, I have the top security credentials that allow me to interview presidents, vice presidents, delegates. And I went up to the police officers and said, you know, you can see my credentials. My colleagues have been arrested. They have the same credentials I do. I need to talk to a commanding officer to have them released. It wasn't seconds before they ripped me through the police line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, threw me up against a car, against the wall, onto the ground, charging me with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. I am still desperately looking for Nicole and Sharif from my vantage point on the ground, and I see Sharif across the parking lot. I demand to be brought to him. Finally, the police do. His arm is bleeding. His hands are behind his back, handcuffed. We're standing there. Our press pass is on. We were demanding to be released, whereupon the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. Then I'm put in a police van. There's Nicole. Her face is bleeding. She's got her credentials on. She's handcuffed. I said, what happened, Nicole? She said, we were in the TV station, heard a commotion. We raced downstairs, camera and microphone in our hands. They wouldn't have been doing their jobs if they hadn't gone downstairs. And they started filming in this parking lot. She was up against the cars. There were some protesters, but mainly riot police. And they suddenly, in formation, came at Nicole. And they're shouting, on your face, whatever that means. And she is filming, not planning to film her own violent arrest, holding her camera, holding up her press pass, saying back to them, press, press. And she didn't know what hit her. They took her down from behind and in front of her, on her face, knee or boot in her back, pulling on her legs, so they're dragging her face through the gravel. And her camera tumbles down. They pull the battery out. If you were wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. And Sharif came up. He's a very cool guy. He said to the riot police, calm down. And they took him and threw him up against the wall, kicked him twice in the chest, bloodying his arm, took him down. They faced PC felony riot charges, probable cause felony riot. I'm taken to the police garage where they've erected cages to put the protesters in. And Nicole and Sharif were taken to jail. The video of our arrests was put on YouTube immediately. It got such a tremendous response, went viral, most watched YouTube video of the first 2 days of the convention. Ultimately that night, after a number of hours, I was released, and then Nicole and Sharif were released. They arrested more than 40 reporters. This shows the power of grassroots activism in St. Paul. Yeah. Sharif was in jail with an AP photographer, and he was released before the AP photographer. Then I'm brought over to the convention to be interviewed by networks. I was in the NBC skybox, and an interview was done. When the camera was closed, an NBC reporter came over and he said, I don't get it. Why wasn't I arrested? And I said, oh, were you outside covering the protest? And he said, no. And so I said, well, I don't get arrested in the skybox either. You know, as Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You've got to get out there. We got to cover the convention floor. We got to get into the corporate suites who's, you know, follow the money, who's funding the conventions. And we have to go out into the streets where the uninvited guests are, sometimes thousands of them. They also have something important to say. Democracy is a messy thing. And, you know, it is our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record.
I mean, it seemed very clear to us as well. We had the same experience that Democracy Now! Did, that the police did not want any record made, and they were treating our journalists and CBS News and KGO and whoever was in their way as the enemy, and needed to get them out of the way.
I mean, we sued. Yeah. We sued the Twin Cities Police and the Secret Service. It was this unprecedented case. It went on for a few years. Yeah. Then a Minneapolis judge called us back last year, and we got a 6-figure settlement and an agreement from the St. Paul Police that they would develop a protocol for how to deal with journalists. And then we held a news conference because we felt the most important thing was send a message to police that they would have to pay a price for doing this. Right. And so we went to the place where we thought the greatest gathering of police would be, which was we held the
Police
news
Plaza.
conference at Occupy Wall Street. Yes, there were hundreds of police officers there. But it is really important. You know, the next day after our arrests,
Yeah.
I had to cover the police press conference in St. Paul, the second day of the convention. And the officer who opened the door to the news conference was my processing officer the night before. And I said to him, you not only have to let me in this news conference, you have to let me out when it's done.
Well
I
done.
asked Chief Harrington, I said, what have you instructed your police officers to do? And how do you expect us to operate in this environment?
Yes.
And he said we could embed with the mobile field force, the police mobile field force, embed, like reporters embed in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low.
Yeah.
You're sleeping with the troops, eating with the troops. Your life is in their hands. I'm not saying reporters aren't brave who do this, but what do you expect to get? Then you have to have reporters embedded in Iraqi hospitals, Afghan communities, in the peace movement around the world to understand the full effects of war. And the idea that this flawed model of reporting is then being re-imported to the United States, and we're being told this is how we have to cover American cities, is unacceptable. And it's also a problem. We should not be embedded in the establishment in Washington. I mean, my brother David and I, also a journalist, we wrote a book called Static. And the reason we called it that is because, you know, that the media should give us the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history.
So I wanted to actually mention your brother David, and you have two other brothers, right? Dan and Steve. So I want to ask a different question.
And David is written for
and
Mother
David,
Jones.
David's written for us too, and a great guy. Several people who submitted cards, in one way or another, were asking questions about how they could become more engaged in social movement activity or in work to change the world for the better. And one person said, I'm in my 20s, I'm a graduate student, I'm loaded with debt, but I've got to do something to, you know, create sanity in my world. Somebody else works with youth and is looking for ways to engage youth in civic work. And we've been to too many of these things where people sit on the stage and say, oh, you know, you should go do this, you should go do that, or don't buy this, or do buy that. And it's like, well, what do I do with that information? But what I actually wanted to ask you was this: if I get the history right, you grow up in Silver Spring.
No, I grew up in Long Island, New
Long
York.
Island, okay.
Yeah.
And you went to Bayshore High School.
Yes,
okay,
I did.
Good. All
But
right,
I did when I was 0 to 2. I lived in Silver Spring.
Okay, so I got the Wikipedia entry wrong, and then
That's okay. Wikipedia gets it wrong.
Right. They obviously needed a fact checker. So you graduated from college in '84. 3 years later, Ralph Nader is asking you to join a group of journalists and activists to go to the occupied territories. Am I getting the time right here? Because there's some.
Well, in 1985, after I graduated, I was turning my thesis into a series of articles for the Multinational Monitor, which is his publication, founded by him and journalist Alan Nairn. And that's when I heard WBAI in New York, the Pacifica radio station there, and I was just amazed by it. And that's when I started working there in the news department. And then I went to the occupied territories with Michael Moore.
So Michael does the foreword to your book, and I just love this. I'm totally shilling for the book. So, and that you and Dennis wrote, and he writes that that when you guys were there, when Israeli soldiers started firing the rubber bullets at us and a group of unarmed Palestinians, we, that is Michael and his gang, would all run the other way, away from the bullets, and Amy Goodman would be running the opposite way, straight into the melee. And so the question I wanted to ask you was, how did you come to this way of being in the world where you run toward trouble? And BAI is a great place to do that.
I wouldn't describe it in that way.
Okay.
I would say that our job as journalists is to go to where the silence is. Whether we were in East Timor, I went there with my colleague Alan Nairn, a very brave journalist. The second time we were there, Alan was writing for the New Yorker magazine, and I was doing a radio documentary. And it was 1991. Yes, there were very few corporate reporters there over the 17 years of Indonesia's occupation of Timor, which was why it was so important to be there, one of the great genocides of the 20th century, and we witnessed a massacre. Over 270 Timorese were killed. We were there because there was this resounding silence, and it is our job to be there.
So I got some more questions from the audience here. We're going to do just one or two more of these, and then we'll open it up to you guys. There's a young woman in the audience who asked, I'm 16. This may not be all about global politics and power, but what advice would you give to a young woman who wants to do the kind of work that you've been doing for the last 16 years?
Absolutely do it. We need young, independent journalists, reporters, documenting what is happening in communities in this country and around the world. I think young people are so well positioned to do this because you naturally have less invested in the system as it is and question authority. I mean, when I was in high school, on my high school newspaper, we were holding the principal accountable with our editorials, and then it's just moving on to a larger stage. But I say follow your heart, your passion, and bring all of your intelligence and skill to bear. It is absolutely critical now that we document what is happening, that we hold those in power accountable.
Yeah. And in your experience and the folks at Democracy Now!, what is it that keeps independent journalism alive? What makes that work?
I think the hunger for it by people all over the world. I mean, the fact that Democracy Now! Began 16 years ago in a few dozen community radio stations is now the largest public media collaboration in the country at 1,100 stations, public radio and television stations, a station a week picking it up. There is this tremendous hunger for independent, authentic voices, people at the heart of the story. And I am lucky enough to have found at the beginning of my career independence, what people look for their whole lives and their career. And that is the essential ingredient of a journalist. I mean, public media is so important. When we're covering war, to be brought to you not by the weapons manufacturers. When we're covering healthcare, not brought to you by the insurance industry or big pharma. When we're covering climate change, not brought to you by the oil, the gas, the coal, the nuclear companies. This is absolutely essential, and it's common sense.
Well, Amy, we're going to open it up to the audience now for questions. I think there are mics somewhere in this room, down at either corner of the stage. And we've got about 15 minutes. We've all been through this before. Please ask questions and keep them short and to the point. There are other opportunities where the speaker's corner will be in operation, but this isn't it, because in courtesy to Amy and to your brothers and sisters in the audience, let's try and really get a conversation going here with Amy. So if you have a question, come on up to the mics, and I'll go back and forth. Yeah, go ahead.
How are you? Thank you for doing this. As a person that works with a lot of youth groups, what can we do to get more young people involved in the civics process? And is the program that Sandra Day O'Connor is promoting, is that an alternative? Do you think it has any possibility?
I'm not familiar with that program.
It's called icivics.org, and she's barnstorming, trying to get more young people involved in civics education.
I mean, democracy now, I think, turns public media on its head in terms of the number of young people who tune in, the broad diversity of people who listen and watch. And I think, my sense is that when people see a reflection of themselves somewhere, when they hear about experiences that resonate with them, they respond. And I think young people are deeply engaged in issues, and it's also a matter of going to where they are.
Yeah.
Hi, Amy. Amy, what do you think is the future of the Electoral College in the United States, and what is your opinion of it?
Let me put that to Steve. That's a very good question, and I don't know. It's a very good question. What's going to happen with it?
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? There is a there's a project called National Popular Vote, which different states state legislatures are being pushed to pass, which would require the electors to cast their ballots at the same proportion as the popular vote in the state. So that's kind of one way forward, national popular vote. But it's like not directly electing senators. Who came up with that idea? Well, it was a way of incorporating certain kind of privilege into the original Constitution, right? The Electoral College is kind of the same thing. Don't yell at me if you're a true believer in the Electoral College. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi, Amy. I saw the debates. They were great. But did you invite Peter Lindsay? She's the candidate for the Socialist Party, and Roseanne Barr, and why or why not?
We invited candidates on who were in many of the states, who were on the ballots. But, certainly everyone has an important voice, and there are over, I believe, 100 presidential candidates.
Yes.
Hi, Amy. Thanks so much for coming today. International question for you. There appears to be a drumbeat towards war with Iran, and in fact, many reports are stating that after the U.S. and Israeli elections upcoming, that there may in fact be such a war. Based on your experience covering both U.S. politics and world affairs, what do you believe is the main real reasons for this drive, and who may be behind it?
We can only go back to what happened with Iraq. The argument for weapons of mass destruction, and the argument for, Iran getting a nuclear weapon. Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying this 30 years ago, saying that Iran was about to have a nuclear weapon within a few years, 30 years ago. I think it is very important for the media to not repeat the same mistake, simply being a megaphone for those in power, but actually doing their own research. Afterwards, the mea culpas are not enough. I remember when the New York Times, a few years after the U.S. invaded Iraq, did that piece on page A10. It was a box that said the New York Times in Iraq. People called it their mea culpa. I called it their kinda culpa. They wouldn't name names, you know, the people like Judith Miller and Michael Gordon, who had continually written these front page pieces alleging weapons of mass destruction. It was getting more and more dire. They had more and more so-called evidence and more unnamed sources. And it ended up just not to be true. The Times actually should have put its mea culpa on the front page as many times as they had articles on the front page that allege WMD, because it takes time to sink into the consciousness of the people of this country. Let us learn from those mistakes.
Hi, regarding Citizens United, what do you think the Republicans are going to do with all that money in the next few weeks? And do you think some of that money might be coming from other governments?
Governments.
Or other governments?
I mean, it's all a very good question because we don't know. And it's not only the Republicans, it's Democrats also. We're talking about billions of dollars will be spent in this election. I can only say, as we cover grassroots movements across the country, you know, made our way from Florida through North Carolina. In North Carolina, at the time of the convention, the Democratic convention, I think something like 10 cities and towns had passed resolutions supporting a move to amend, a constitutional amendment challenging Citizens United. New Jersey is the latest state to do this. And we're seeing a tremendous response across the country around that. That's a grassroots movement that is definitely worth watching. People's frustration with how it is that money could drown politics and democracy in this country.
Amy, I wonder if you could share the secrets of your amazing memory with us. Are you taking any supplements, or is it just a family gift? But seriously, I wanted to know if, in light of recent events, if you'd maybe comment on security at U.S. embassies.
And that relates to remembering facts. I mean, you know, to see how the issue of security is raised in the political debate, the fact that Republicans, together with Democrats, said, Republicans voting to defund, you know, make it very difficult to maintain the security at these embassies. But I think it goes to a bigger issue about safety in the world and the issue of national security. I think we have to be very serious about how people view us in the world. And I also think this goes to the issue of independent media. I think so many issues come back to independent media. You know, I talked about how the media needs to be brought to us by something other than weapons manufacturers, oil, gas, coal companies. When we cover all of these issues, must be independent, brought to us by listeners and viewers. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Not only how important it is to see the rest of the world through something other than a corporate lens, but that the rest of the world sees us through something other than you know, a lens that is funded by corporations who profit from war. I always go back to World War II, this example of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who was choosing the list, the target list of cities to bomb in Japan, to drop the first atomic bombs on. And it said, the list that he was given said Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto, and he crossed off Kyoto. Why? Because he and Mrs. Stimson had visited Kyoto, and the people were wonderful, the food delicious, the art was magnificent. Now, if only the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been so lucky as to host the Stimsons, but this is a bigger, more profound point. his point was that he knew the city, and so he didn't want to destroy it. That, I think, we can extend to independent media, is that how do we learn about the world? We learn about it from our family and friends, people who live in other countries, but mostly through the media. And that is why it is so critical that there be this forum where we come to understand each other, where people can speak for themselves. There's nothing that breaks down bigotry, stereotypes, caricatures more. That we come to know the rest of the world and the world comes to know us. I think that is the greatest guarantor of our safety. And we need a media that goes outside the consensus of the Democrats and Republicans in Washington. Just use the example of the last presidential debate between Mitt Romney and President Obama in Boca Raton, talking about foreign policy. On the key issues, on Afghanistan, on the escalating drone attacks, the candidates agree. We need a media that goes outside of that. Here we are in San Francisco. Everyone should read the report of the Stanford Law School and NYU Law School called Living Under Drones. Most people have no idea what is happening, that the US is engaged in drone, it's not even warfare, but drones bombing areas of Pakistan, Yemen, and other countries. And it is increasing tremendous hostility toward the United States. I mean, in Pakistan, the vast majority of people see the United States as the enemy when we are supposed to be an ally of Pakistan. We need to, as journalists, go outside of this agreement of the major parties and really reflect what is people are feeling in the world. That's what's going to increase our security.
So unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. I'm sorry. And you're it. So make it a good one, brother.
Okay. Well, it's San Francisco, and somebody has to bring up gay marriage, right? So let's see. I think we have absolutely crossed the line of demarcation where we know now that gay people are seen in this country as second-class citizens. That's just a fact. And recently, I've had some heroes. 2 different straight couples got married, and they said, even though we're having a ceremony, we're not getting the license because we stand in solidarity with our gay friends. So my question to you is, it's kind of, I don't know how somebody could know one gay person and apply for that marriage license. So my question to you is, do you think, would you advise somebody, a straight couple, to not get that license because of the ramifications of continuing the, it's now become the country club that only certain people can belong to and have benefits from?
Well, as a journalist, I would cover those people who make those decisions. And, this is why we travel the country, is to hear stories like these and to give voice to what is happening on the ground. And certainly the issue of gay marriage is a critical one. I mean, it's just like I was talking about the issue of immigration being the new civil rights movement. I mean, there is no question that talking about equality is key everywhere, and the movement for it is absolutely critical one to cover.
Thanks, Amy. That actually is a perfect note to conclude this World Affairs program. Please join me in thanking Amy Goodman for a terrific presentation. I'm also supposed to remind you that Amy.